Kia ora, everyone. Let's talk about Aroha and diversity in Catholic schools. It's a document published earlier this month by the Catholic Bishops of New Zealand. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Cameron Surrey, Senior Lay Chaplain at the Auckland Catholic Tertiary Chaplaincy. I'm joined by the Director of LifeNet. He's an educator, motivational speaker. He's a communications and media consultant. He hosts the Dispatches podcast, not to mention being the father of 4 and a husband of 1. Brendan
No, father of 5, mate.
Oh, you're father of 5.
Don't forget my youngest. She'll be really angry with you.
Oh no. Well, that shows how little time I've spent around your family in recent years.
Oh, mate. No, it happens to the best of us. It's called age, mate.
Well, welcome anyway, and thanks for coming on to this conversation. I just wanted to get the ball rolling, Brendan, with this document on diversity. Did it come as a surprise for you? Were you expecting something? Did you have hopes for this document? And what were your first impressions?
I knew something had to happen sooner or later, because it's just becoming such a pressing issue. It just seemed like it was going to be inevitable, that it had to be responded to. And there is definitely a very militant ideological lobby group outside of the church who were just putting increasing pressure on all sorts of areas, and in particular in schools. And so it was inevitable that something had to come. My hopes, I'd heard the document was coming a little bit before it arrived. I was hoping that we would see a really clearly enunciated and well communicated presentation of the beautiful and rich tradition when it comes to human anthropology that the church has to offer the world. And my first my reaction to the document was I was a bit sad, because I think the document, for whatever reason, and I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I think the document is actually lacking in some major ways. And there's also some stuff in there that just had me sort of scratching my head and saying, I don't understand how this is consistent, or even some of the strategic things sort of from a pastoral perspective, how this is even strategic with our, as I said, that beautiful, rich tradition when it comes to human sexuality and human identity and what it is to be human to the fullest, made in the image and likeness of God. And so, yeah, like, for example, one of the things I was a little bit surprised by was, to my recollection, I don't recall that there was any mention of even the words male or female. And I was really surprised by that, because obviously that would be something that would speak right to the heart of this issue. So, yeah, I have to say, I had high hopes, but the end result was I was disappointed and frustrated by some of the stuff that's in the document. Yeah,
and we're going to go through sort of bit by bit some of the key parts of this document. My own encounter with the document was quite different. I don't think I was really expecting anything. I've been out of the country for all of September, and the first I heard about it was actually being invited to sign a petition, going to the nuncio about sort of complaining about this document. And so I thought, whoa, I better read the thing. But interestingly, it made me come at the document probably quite differently to how I would have if I just read it in a normal way after it was released, because I would guess I came at it with the question of, like, how is this document really terrible? Yeah. And so probably my bar then was a lot lower when I was reading it, because I was kind of like, oh yeah, that's not too terrible, and yeah, no, that's not bad, and because I was trying to decide whether to sign the petition or not, and that was my main reason for reading it. And so, like, I kind of got to the end and I thought, well, after a quick read anyway, I thought I can't see anything that's a definite error in that, so I'll sort of hold my fire for now. But I think what struck me was more like stepping back from the whole situation and seeing a way of communicating that I think leaves a lot to be desired in the church in New Zealand, where a document gets released and maybe there was consultation, but actually it takes a lot of people by surprise, and then there's a reaction against it, to going to some higher authority, and at least that's what I could see from my own perspective at that point. And I thought we need to have some proper conversation around this, and some long engaged conversation. And so that's why I reached out to you, Brendan. First of all, I thought you'd make a great conversation partner, and I was pleased that you had strong views about the document as well. And so it would make for a really good conversation about it. But really, my intention here is I want to sort of start or extend a forum within the church, flowing out of our emphasis on synodality that we've sort of just started with last year with that synod, and asking, well, how do we actually put this into practice when big issues come up? How do we actually process them, digest them as a church? And for that, I think we need to use the and you're all into this, I know, Brendan, because you do this sort of professionally, but using the means that we have, the communication we have, to have these conversations. And I think it shouldn't just be Brendan Malone doing this. It should be many of us taking up this challenge to have these kinds of conversations. And that's why I wanted to throw in my lot, I suppose.
Awesome. I couldn't agree more, mate. I really couldn't. And I think it's funny you should say the initial reactions, because I think that's one of the traps is we read something, we maybe remember the things about, say, for example, in this case, a document that really stuck out to us the most and maybe hit an emotional chord. And that could be positive or negative.
Yeah.
And then we go away and we don't reflect on it. We don't go back to it. We don't really contemplate deeper. And so like you, I initially read it and there were things that really hit me. And I was like, so there were moments you're like, well, that's well phrased. And there were other bits you were like, gosh, it wasn't good, I felt. And so I thought, well, I got to go away though and come back, because the temptation is that you color the whole document through either a very positive or a very negative lens. And you tend to just be very reactionary. And so for me, I went back and reread it a couple of times, and I was like, okay, now I'm a bit more comfortable where I think things should be improved and could be improved, and where things weren't so bad. It's not like the whole thing is a write-off. And I think that's important for all of us to consider whenever we engage with anything like this, because the modern tendency is to be very reactive.
Totally. And I think when we have a conversation like this, there's always the danger that we'll change our perspective on things, and that's I guess the spice of life in a way, that if we stick to our own thoughts and maybe just our own circles, then we can stick within our own limited understanding. But we talk to somebody with a different perspective, then we get to broaden our understanding. So I think it's great. Let's maybe we'll just wade in. The first part, which is page 2 of the document, it's in the introduction, and it's sort of laying out what the document is for. And it says, this document is not intended to be a statement of Catholic understanding of the anthropology of the human person. It is focused on the young people themselves who are being challenged by the growing and often confusing awareness of self in all its dimensions as they journey through adolescence. Yeah, what did you take on? What did you make of that in terms of indicating the intention of the document?
Well, it's kind of, that was one of the things that really stuck out to me as being a problematic part of the document, because I just don't see how you can respond to a question of anthropology without actually laying out a true anthropology. We live in a culture which has a flawed anthropology, and there's a whole lot of very serious and harmful lies to human flourishing that exist out there, and that are, particularly the harm in this area. When we talk about the issue of, for example, gender identity confusion and the impact that is having in the lives of young people, and the very serious harms that are being done and even normalized. I had the privilege last year of being able to have a conversation on my YouTube channel with a young lady called Daisy from America. And Daisy was someone who was detransitioning. So she'd been through this process. She had had a mastectomy, had had her breasts removed, and then had come to this realization that this wasn't the way. This wasn't actually where her flourishing was found, and was now reversing that. But she will be left with a lifelong and permanent change to her physicality, because no one was there to actually offer her another alternative vision along that path, and to effectively, I'd say, protect her from the harm that came through that journey. And so I think if you're going to address an area of anthropology, I think you've got to actually, and the culture desperately needs the church to be doing this, because more and more I've come to see just how important the church is, even though at times we are often marginalized and we are even ridiculed for the truths that we hold to. The fact that we proclaim those truths very clearly and very loudly is still important, because it keeps the worst excesses in check. And if the voice of the church is not in the public square, then we've just ceded that ground over to very extreme, revolutionary and reactionary forces. And so that's why for me, I'm like, well, what you need here is you definitely need that beautiful, rich anthropology to be presented. And then you have a counterpoint from which you can sort of hinge off and say, here's what the problems are in these opposing ideologies, and then here's how we walk this path of never betraying our own anthropology and trying to reach out to people and offer it to them, even when they might experience confusion. And I think the interesting thing about that statement you just read is there's almost like a contradiction in a sense. In the first part says we're not going to talk about anthropology, but then the second part talks about it will just be focused on the young people themselves. But it's not just about the young people. It's actually about their anthropology and their anthropological views they have about themselves. You know what I mean? So that there's already a clear, I would say, issue and contradiction even in that statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not that it doesn't have anthropological material in it. Maybe that's more saying this is not going to be a comprehensive anthropology. So yeah, maybe that's what that's functioning as. I got the impression, especially after reading the Australian document, which I've got here, which reads quite differently and which does have a summarized anthropology. And I thought, well, this New Zealand document seems to be more aimed at young people. So maybe the author's asking, what are young people actually going to read? And if we start getting into, I don't know, more philosophical, technical language, then maybe we're going to lose a lot of them in the first page.
Yeah, potentially. But then I would say there's two things about that. Number one is I think we assume too little of young people. If we assume that we can't have because I do a lot of work with young people, high school and university age, and I present to them. A lot of my work is actually presenting a sort of an understanding of the flawed ideologies and philosophies that have led the West into the current crisis it's in, and addressing a lot of these issues. And it's not so much the substance of what you're saying, it's the delivery that matters. And so I think you can deliver, and you're right, there's no way you'd be expecting a comprehensive anthropology. That would be book length at minimum, you know. Yeah. And but to not even have the fundamentals laid out, and to me also, when you look at the document, I mean, really, can we honestly say that a young person would read this document and engage with it and say, oh, this is really speaking to me? Because I never got that sense as someone who specializes in communication, that it's and then on top of that, of course, is the question of, well, what about parents? Because young people don't exist as autonomous, self-choosing individuals. And that's certainly not our anthropology for anyone, but particularly for children. They exist within the context of the family. And the document does point to that. But the problem is then, why would the document be talking around parents when that's where the subsidiarity lies? They're the ones who actually should be the ones that are being addressed here, and young people. You know, you do both and, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that leads into the second point we're going to discuss, which is about the dialogue. It says that this document is the result of dialogue between bishops, principals, national and diocesan Catholic education leaders, and young people. But as you pointed out in our previous communication, it doesn't mention parents.
No.
Is that problematic?
It is. It is. I think it really is. And as a parent, and I know I've had a lot of feedback to me personally, and I'm not going to betray any confidences, but I've had a lot of feedback from people, teachers, priests, parents, all around the country. And there's a lot of people who are really concerned about the document. And one of the things that was consistent that you hear from parents is the fact that they were, especially in the age of, or the moment, if you like, of synodality. I think there should have been a widespread and comprehensive consultation of some kind with parents, because obviously the document understands there has to be some sort of collaboration here. And I think that's a really big and glaring oversight, because our Catholic tradition is just so very, very clear about this, that the role of parents is never and should never be usurped. The norm is, for the principle of subsidiarity, is that the authority lies with the parents to actually govern the family, and to be the first educators and the nurturers and protectors of their children. And this is an issue where there is definitely all of those factors are at play. So there's an educational factor, there's a nurturing factor, a protective factor here, because there's no doubt there's hostile ideologies and also harmful pitfalls here. And it's I know the feedback I've received from a lot of really good, and these are not people you could sort of pigeonhole as being reactionary, radical Catholics or anything like that. They are ordinary, everyday members of New Zealand parishes. They're giving their time. They're there every Sunday. They're trying to do the best they can to be faithful to the church. And they feel really hurt by the fact this document appears to have just, I think what a lot of them would say is, and certainly this was my sense, is it leaves us vulnerable as parents. It does. It's because it doesn't present a strong, clear voice to this very bullying ideology. And so as a parent, you're sort of then stuck in this very odd situation where you face the potential of having people say, well, what's the problem? You know, this document says we're okay to do what we want to do, or, you know, whether it's within the family home or other educators saying that to you, or whatever. It's, you know, I think that's the general sense I got, is a lot of them feel that there needed to be a really clear and strong, like I said earlier, if the voice of the church is not clear and strong where it really needs to be, and this is one of the issues of our age right now, and if you look at Pope Francis, he has been unequivocal and unwavering in his condemnation of this ideology and what's going on. He said really, really strong things. And so if the voice of the church is not strong, then the public square is ceded to other equally strong voices with very bad ideas that will do harm, spiritual, emotional, psychological, even physical now in this area.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think parents have a special perspective because of that. I guess it's that instinctive, protective perspective or power that parents have. And I mean, hopefully some of those other people that were part of the consultation are also parents and were engaging in the process, at least partly as parents as well. But yeah, it seems that the parental perspective is really important. The next part we're going to talk about is on page 4. It's paragraph 12. Certainly, gender dysphoria and sexual diversity is real. There is also experience of those who have transitioned, wishing in later life that they had not, often revealing a reality that they felt strong pressure as young people to conform to others' expectations and or to make decisions about who they were when they were filled with uncertainty. What do you think about that as a sort of painting the part of the problem or the tension or the difficulty we're in?
Well, I would say there's certainly truth in that second part. That there are definitely, and it's a growing number of people who call themselves detransitioners now, who have come to say, look, this was a disaster. And I'm seeing more and more of these stories online. One of the things that, for example, that is really important in all of this for people to understand is that the mental health, and particularly the suicide rates for people pre-transition and post-transitioning, they're very similar. It doesn't change. And that's a really big red flag. And it's very high. It's very high on both sides of the equation. And that's a really big red flag that what you're doing is not actually, even from a utilitarian perspective, not even producing a good consequence, if you like. And online, if you're someone who's in this space like I am, you see a lot of this and you realize more and more that there are a lot of voices, and often a lot younger now too. It's not just people later in life like this document refers to here. It's actually very young people now who are sort of saying, gosh, this was a mistake. And one of the constant trends you see is people saying, I wish someone had been there to actually be effectively the adult in the room and offer me an alternative. The first part, though, I was confused by that statement, where it says certainly gender dysphoria and sexual diversity is real. Now, gender dysphoria is a real thing, right? The confusion that some people can have about their bodies.
Yeah.
They are confused. A male or a female who is confused in their thinking about their body, there's a disconnect. In the same way that people have anorexia, for example, and they have a psychological confusion about their body.
But also, I think we all experienced in the beginnings of puberty, especially, discomfort, right, in the body as it's changing, right? So that might be like a very minor thing in comparison to someone with real dysphoria. But we all have some little experience of that, right?
Well, and I think too, particularly, this is another factor in all of this that needs to be considered, is that young people, there's a couple of things at play here. Number one is young people, and particularly in the modern context, we are dealing with a demographic who are very, very much in a difficult position now when it comes to identity. And the reason for that is because, when you're young and, the hormones are flowing, like say puberty hits, and you're sort of trying to find your place in the world, you're recognizing that, you're going to be moving out of home at some point. Your mum and dad are looking a little bit older than what they were, 5 years ago. And all of that stuff's going on. But on top of that now, we live in a very anthropologically confused Western society. And there's no getting away from that. What the fruits of Enlightenment liberalism, which put the radical, autonomous, self-choosing individual at the top of the pile, have created a whole nother layer of complexity on that and separated young people away from family, from tradition, from the things that would normally help them journey through and really ground themselves and basically give them stable footing that they could plant themselves in as they go through that journey. So all of that's eroded as well. Plus you've got this, you've got a very vulnerable cohort, and you've got groups actively saying to them, oh, did you feel today that you didn't quite feel masculine enough or feminine enough? Maybe that's because you're not actually that gender that you think you are. And so I think there's this massive, it's a serious problem. And that's why I think it's a matter of, when you talk about treading carefully, the primary focus is on how do we actually protect young people from bad ideas that have bad consequences. And so when I saw, gender dysphoria is real and, sexual diversity is real, I'm sort of going, what, like it's a statement that I think I know what they mean, but it's like there's some precision and clarity that's lacking there, because from a Catholic perspective, our tradition is very clear. We go back to the scriptures on this. This is the Judeo-Christian tradition. Male and female, we are created, and that's how we image God. And so if you're going to say that there's diversity beyond that, then no, that's not correct at all. And we also have a very clear vision about what authentic human sexuality and self-giving within sexuality looks like. And as Catholics, we've got a very rich and beautiful tradition in that regard. So I think when you talk into these spaces, I think we've got to be very clear that we are speaking or at least enunciating clearly our actual tradition, and not ending up sort of selling out our tradition by just picking up buzzwords from the culture of the day, if you like.
Yeah, with the Australian document, I think one of the strengths of it actually ends, it's almost an appendix on the end, but it has a whole lot of definitions of terms. And I found it really helpful, because some of those terms, when I saw them, I thought, I've seen that before. If someone asked me to define it, I don't think I'd be able to do so confidently. And but it's not just descriptive. It also gives a little bit of, like, makes some judgment calls as well. And so it emphasizes them that we do say, for example, have a binary view of humanity, of male and female, though it adds the caveat that there is such a thing as intersex, where for genetic reasons or whatever, people are born and it's a bit hard to tell which, they've probably got a combination of genitalia or something like that. That is a thing. It's very rare, but it's still a thing, and it does need to be acknowledged.
Well, can I speak to that point, because this is important. The whole thing about intersex conditions are and I think this is still the case in other countries, for example, you'll often go to the intersex society websites, and they will have they'll have disclaimers. They'll say this is not a transgender website. And so they don't, a lot of people in that situation, they don't see themselves as being anything to do with the gender sort of constructionist ideology and the transgender movement in any way. And that's because an intersex condition, some of the main intersex conditions are actually they are categorized as birth defects, and they do have health risks that have to be monitored throughout a person's life. And they're also quite clearly, you're not dealing with a completely different gender there. You're dealing with something in the physiology that hasn't quite developed as it should, or something that's, or maybe like you've talked about people who have both sets of genitalia or some sort of other issue in that regard. But it's generally what you find is people in the intersex category, and this has been from time immemorial, have felt comfortable with who they are, and they have a very clear understanding. Oh, I am a male with this, or I am a female with this. Do you know what I mean? And I think what's happened, a part of the issue here has been the trans movement, if you like, has tried to co-opt intersex into their movement, and I think probably to try and give a little bit more legitimacy to something that's not that. And so that's something that needs to be considered, I think, in all of this.
Going on to page 5, paragraph 14, it says, at times, the desire for justice can become associated with particular ideologies and may become disassociated with Catholic understanding. It is important young people receive authoritative Catholic education in these areas where they can affirm and test the reality of what the Church teaches, rather than accept as truth often limited secular interpretations of this rich teaching. So there, sorry, I didn't really give the context, but the context is talking about identity and sexuality. So at least the document seems to be giving a nod to the danger of the ideologies. It does that in a few places.
Well, it's also in that place there too. That's one statement I really liked. Because it gives a very clear mandate that this has to be taught. Our truth, our tradition has to be taught. St. Paul says in the book of Romans, how will the people know the truth if they don't hear it preached? So pray for a preacher to be sent. In other words, there has to be that prophetic element of the church. Without a prophetic voice, the people cast off restraint, or the people perish, is another version of that particular scripture. And so I was really encouraged by that statement, because that's what we need to hear more of. And we need to be very clear about that. Now, interestingly enough, one of the things that I found a little bit conflicting with that was later in the document, we get into some of the practical strategies. It talks about the possibility of allowing outside groups who don't have our anthropology to come in and teach our students. And straight away I was going, well, hold on, that doesn't make sense. That to me, if you're going to say, yep, let's teach this thing in all of its richness and fullness and teach it with authority, you have to have people who are living it and who embrace it and who accept it. And it really is. I mean, I'll tell you what, if you want to talk to young people and talk about young people, one of the things that they will see through a million miles away is inauthentic people and a lack of sincerity. If you don't believe it, you don't live it, then, don't try and open your mouth and teach it. It's just not going to wash.
What I recall, I'm just trying to find it from the document, but I thought it talked about, it sort of acknowledges there's organizations, it's probably thinking about things like Rainbow Youth or something like that, whose ideology is clearly in conflict with Catholic faith and anthropology. It mentioned more that there might be individuals within organizations who are more amenable to Catholic ethos and could be called upon. I think it will, but it wasn't saying bring in.
No, but that's my point, though. I don't see how you can have that marriage and make it work. I really don't. If they were absolutely amenable to the Catholic anthropology, they wouldn't be part of those other organizations that embrace a completely opposing anthropology. And I think that's a factor here, that some of that practical stuff. Another one was the whole notion of having pride weeks in a school. I don't see how you can do that and then try to present an authentic anthropology, which is clearly in stark contrast to what is promoted as part of the concept of pride, which is there's a whole ideological and practical component to that. And so for me, I think that's where I don't know, maybe it's just that this thing hadn't been maybe fleshed out enough, or this is maybe where if you have a more synodal process, you actually get feedback from people to say, hey, you know, that this is going to be a problem here.
I thought when Pride's mentioned, I mean, the document, doesn't it sort of talk about renaming and repurposing in a way? So
it talks about the one thing it refers to as that pink t-shirt anti-bullying day, because that's a very clear example now that has a broad thing. Yeah. But the whole notion, it talks about the idea of maybe you could sort of broaden Pride, but yeah. I really don't see how you can do that. It's the other side would probably say, hey, hold on a minute. If they weren't happy to actually be smuggling themselves in under the carpet, basically, and saying we're here, I think they'd be saying, hey, that's ideological appropriation of our stuff, for starters. But secondly, I don't really see how that works. Like, Pride Week is a very clear sexual ideological construct. And to sort of say, well, let's take that very clear, everyone knows what that is, and we'll say, but it's broader than that, or it's about this as well, or about something else. I really don't see how you do anything other than have a Clayton's Catholic event happening there. Do you know what I mean? It's not I think at the best you could hope for, and I really mean this, the best you could hope for would be confusion among students about where does the church actually stand then.
Yeah, I've found the part, it says, for example, the focus of a proposed Pride Day could be oriented towards inclusion of everyone. Yeah, okay, so it doesn't say to rename it.
No. I mean, Pride is, it's like, everyone knows what pride is in that context when it's not a sin that we're referring to.
The sentence before does talk about renaming and refocusing. So, okay, I'm trying to resurrect this or redeem this.
yeah.
It's a very Catholic thing to say, take a pagan festival, and like stamp it with like a real Catholic meaning, and change a whole lot of things, but we replace it basically with our own thing. So that if people go like, oh, why aren't you doing anything for Pride Week? We're like, oh no, we do a thing. It's just different. Instead of like we do nothing, like we're standing back here doing nothing during Pride Week. We're actually doing something that is actually in accordance with our ethos. We've renamed it. We've refocused it. We've piggybacked on a secular thing, but we've used it to push harder our own ethos.
Yeah, I don't think that's and like there's definitely, you're right. There's a history of the church redeeming things. Like you give the example of pagan festivals, but what you don't do is you don't have the pagan festival operating alongside of the thing you've redeemed.
Sure.
And that's the difference. The church says, okay, let's take this and redeem it. Let's not have this thing here and this thing here. And that's what you'd have. You'd have a society, for example, that'd be doing this, and we'd say, well, let's do this at the same time. And like I said, I think the best you'd end up with was confusion. I really do. I think that would be the best you could hope for in that situation in the minds of people who are observing. And I think the worst is a situation where you just get a full-on Pride Day or week happening at a school and people saying, oh, yeah, sure, we also had a special mass. You know what I mean? Like it's, and this is where I think parents and their input is so important, being able to say, hey, look, this makes us uneasy, or this is, you know, and look, I'm not trying to say here that necessarily everything here has some magic silver bullet answer. Very rarely when you're dealing with complex, and I would argue too, as I said, very hostile and dominant. There is a very, the current sexual anthropology and the associated lobby groups, they have hegemony at the moment. They have control and they wield a lot of power. And so it's hard to sort of operate in that space and to sort of tread those lines. And you're trying to think about how do you remain and maintain that position of love, right? Christ calls us to. But one thing I know is that you can have the love, you can have, the truth presented to people without love, but you can never have or authentic love without the truth. And so I think the danger is that when you muddy the water, when things get murky, when you do things like this, I don't see us actually there at that point presenting our own anthropology. I see us just piggybacking off of a false and very flawed anthropology. And I think that's for me, I mean, at a practical level, I just don't see how that works. And I've heard, interestingly, feedback from a lot of teachers who have said, that was one of the things that stuck out to them, because their instinct was that what will happen is that often you either get the sort of the easiest road will be taken, and that will be effectively just to have a Pride Week and tack a few Catholic.
Yeah. No, fair point. Page 5 again. This is verse 17, paragraph 17. Catholic marriage includes and requires the possibility of a child being born of their shared sexual intimacy, created and nurtured in the couple's love. This does not mean that other couples cannot commit to wonderful, loving, and enduring relationships. It simply means that such relationships are not sacramental marriage within the Catholic Church, as they cannot be open to the possibility of new life without external intervention.
Wow, yeah, this is one of those points at which you go, I think this at bare minimum, this needed better. This needs to be rewritten, that statement. Because one of the things that really stuck out to me was, I know people who are in sacramental marriages who are grappling with the burden of infertility, and they require outside interventions to help them bring a child into the world. Obviously ethical ones that the church would be okay with. But they satisfy that criteria, but they're not in a sacramental marriage. Do you know what I mean? So even that definition there is sloppy. And I think also there's a little bit of dirty pool, if you like, going on here in a sense. I've seen this in other places around the globe where people are trying to make this distinction between sacramental marriage and other, like for example, gay marriage, the legal construct invented by the state, or other forms of relationships, and sort of just trying to put them alongside each other in parallel, but just, they're different, but they're in parallel, if you like. And that's not our anthropology. And I think that paragraph really stuck out to me. And I think that particularly for us as Catholics, our anthropology has some really beautiful things to say about what authentic love is. And in this context of sexual intimacy, it's really clear around what is and what does and doesn't meet that definition of loving, even if we might find it, for example, to be an enduring relationship or wonderful, which is a very self-referential perspective. The individual subject might say, I am gratified. I find things sentimental and really, I find myself emotionally connected to this person in this relationship. But the church would say love is a much higher thing again, that's seeking the good of the other. And in the sexual context, there's a whole other dynamic there. That call to self-giving love includes what we do with our bodies.
Yeah,
this is why for the church, for example, the homosexual acts are where the sin lies. It's not the desire, the attraction. It's where, if it's acted upon, and so you see that act moves outside the realm of love. So I think for me that paragraph is not well worded and actually has some issues that need addressing.
Yeah, because there's a number of different distinctions at play well, there should be there, right? Because there's a distinction between sacramental marriage and marriage, right? Yep. Through marriage, natural marriage, and both of those require a man and a woman.
Yeah.
And as you said, we'll need to fact check this, but
can I say, Cam, it's also, as you were reading it before, it really struck me again, was that it is the heterosexual complementarity of men and women, that bodily complementarity that God has allows us to image them in. That is what actually gives rise to marriage as well in the first place. Yeah, it's not just a requirement.
Yeah, and children are a fruit that you hope for, but it's not really a requirement because of, as you said, we don't test people's fertility before we let them get married or anything like that. Right. So we hope for children, and the openness to children is a requirement, but the actual having them is a gift, I suppose. And so there's that distinction. And now, I mean, yes, there can be loving, enduring relationships between two people of the same sex, right? It's possible to, that even people that make use of the new law provision around same-sex marriage, which we don't technically regard as a marriage, but if there's a friendship there, if there's real loyalty between them and care and respect, and they're actually seeking each other's good, and we know that we're all imperfect in this anyway in our marriages. So you can say, oh, but they're doing that and they're doing this, and we're like, yeah, yes, fine, but we're all imperfect when it comes to how we exercise this love for each other in marriage.
Of course.
So I think that does need to be affirmed, but there's just, there's a few more distinctions that need to be better expressed in that. Yeah.
Look, here's one thing that was interesting for me reading the document, and this is one point where I sort of sense it, and I sense it in other places as well. You sort of get the sense that you've got people who are writing this who are very much feeling the pressure of a very intensive outside lobby group. And that's what we're dealing with here. It is bullying that often goes on, and we've seen a lot of it in the public square of late. The targeting of schools, and it must have been on the minds of the people writing this document. Oh man, do we want, what happened, say, at Bethlehem College and some of the other Christian schools? Do we want them targeting us as well? And you sort of get a sense that that's perhaps weighed down and created an unhelpful limiting of our language and our speaking our voice. But our voice needs to be heard. It has every right to be heard. It should be heard. I think one of the challenges of our age is this belief that somehow, because we have a religious tradition, we are somehow the biased ones, and everyone else who sits in the pool of liberalism is somehow just being sort of sitting in the middle ground and is without bias. They're not. Everyone has their own bias, their own tradition, whether they know it or not, or accept it or not. And so what that means then, it's really important that we know that these things that Christ has given to us are true, and why wouldn't we want to transmit them to the culture as well and allow others to access those truths if they so desire.
Yeah, but definitely agree with you. Like, it's a bit of a hospital pass, isn't it, when you get asked to write a document like this? So I can understand those writing it are under quite a bit of pressure in our current situation. Next, this is one I really want to talk about, actually. Paragraph 18 is quoting quotes the Bishop of Parramatta, Vincent Long. Says schools need to follow a pastoral approach with young people, teaching them the wisdom of the church without the condemnation. As Australian Bishop Vincent Long Van Nguyen said, we cannot talk about the integrity of creation, the universal and inclusive love of God, while at the same time colluding with the forces of oppression and the ill treatment of racial minorities, women, and homosexual persons. It won't wash with young people, especially when we purport to treat gay people with love and compassion, and yet define their sexuality as intrinsically disordered.
Well, for me, it was also, I think he goes on, doesn't he, and talks about this is particularly true, let me quote this, when the church has not been a shining beacon and a trailblazer in the fight against inequality and intolerance. And so there's two things that struck out for me there. Number one is I remember when this statement was made its appearance in the public square. And first of all, it was controversial at the time, even in Australia. So it was kind of, it's odd why we would import something that already has a whole lot of controversy associated with it here into our document. Secondly, it's an opinion, and it's an opinion that I think, clearly it seems to be contradicting our own Catholic tradition, which is that homosexual acts are disordered, and there seems to be an implication here that maybe homosexuality is part of God's ordered creation. It fails to recognize the fallen nature of the world. And the fallen state of the world. It seems to be more siding with more of a modern Freudian identity-based approach to human sexuality. It certainly seems to be in there. And then the other thing that really stuck out to me, and I found very frustrating, was the second part where he says that the church has not been a shining beacon and a trailblazer in the fight against inequality and intolerance. That is just untrue. I don't know how else to put it. That's not true. The last 2,000 years of improvements in human social conditions have come on the back of the teachings of Christ. And it's really this, we've got secular academics who are writing whole books now about this point. And it's really sort of heartbreaking for me to see a bishop who is saying things like this. Like it is the church and our Christian teachings have been at the forefront of advances and wherever inequality and intolerance and genuine injustice has happened. I mean, the word, for example, the phrase social justice is a Catholic phrase. It comes out of a Catholic religious context, And there are so many different examples you can cite through history where the church has actually been the defender and at the forefront of these things. And so it's frustrating, because what it does is it plays into a secular myth about the church that is not true. And so for me, it was like this statement doesn't need to be in the document. It feels like someone felt they wanted to make their own personal ideological opinion known, and they inserted this. And it definitely, I think, strays from what is historically true. And also, I think it raises questions about whether or not it's even conforming to what our Catholic tradition actually is.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you on that last line. Now, I'm interested in the language of intrinsically disordered, because like it's in the Catechism, right? And so it's sort of official doctrine. But the problem with the language, like on a practical level these days, is if you say that, regardless of how many explanations you try to offer, people hear you're calling me a sicko. Basically, you're fundamentally sick in your being, or something like that. If you're saying, even if you say it's not the person, it's the whatever, like intrinsically disordered is going to be understood as in quite in a very harsh light.
Look, and I've got no qualms about that.
Yeah.
But this then comes to another question, and or another point, and that point is, well, from whose perspective are we supposed to be governing and presenting reality to the world, or what that vision of reality? And that's very much the subjectivist view. The subject who says, well, I find that offensive, so you should actually change what you say. I would argue that our tradition is very clear on this, that we are supposed to conform ourselves to God's vision of reality and as the author of all things. And therefore, what that means is we have to have the courage to actually speak truthfully. Now, there might be times where it might not be appropriate to have that particular conversation. Sure, that's for me, that's not an issue. But the notion that you would just remove that entirely, the concept of, because the reality is, funnily enough, I've heard some of the best exponents of this are people who actually widen it up to explain that, in effect, adultery is an intrinsically disordered act as well, for example. And I think, I don't think we're doing any service to the truth, that's for sure. And I don't think we're doing any service to people who are actually caught up in serious moral and sinful errors. I don't see how you're helped out of that by people sort of just maybe avoiding or watering down the truth. And I think for me, the thing is, I look at this as a Catholic and I go, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to take and trust the opinions of an individual bishop, or am I supposed to follow the mind of the church? And you see what I mean? For me, at that point, it's a no-brainer. You stay within the heart and the mind of the church.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think it's a prudence issue here too. And what I'm looking for is how do I speak about these issues in a way where I can be very consistent, regardless of who I'm speaking to. It doesn't mean I say exactly the same thing to everybody, but I'm not going to use this phrase most of the time, and I don't even know if it's the best phrase to use, because it might give the wrong impression. I'm not saying the phrase is false, by the way, because understood correct, but it implies a whole philosophical view, like the human being ordered to a particular end, and that end would be like happiness, and in the end, like beatitude with God. It implies all these things that is just not in people's minds. And so on a practical level, the phrase is not generally going to be helpful when it comes to speaking to people who don't have that framework. But yeah, I want to have an integrity where if somebody asks me, what do you think about all these things? I want to be able to speak really honestly and truly. But I don't have one way of saying it to Catholics and another way of saying it to everyone else. Or, do you know what I mean?
No, but this is where I think we've got to just have a little bit of courage and a recognition. I think one of the dangers is maybe we think that we're supposed to appeal to the greatest number of people at all times. That's never been the mandate, but that's never been the promise.
I want to be understood. If I'm going to use words, the point of using words is to be understood, if possible.
Sure.
Regardless of all my efforts, I might be misunderstood. Fine.
Mm.
But that's regardless of all my efforts. So I'm talking about my efforts here. How am I trying to be better understood? And so I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I'm still working out my position on this.
Yeah, sure.
You're helping
But
me.
let me ask you a question then. Let's be Socratic about this. Let's imagine that someone says to you, and you, because I often do this myself, I nuance the way, this is good communication. I try and form empathy with the person, and if the doorway is open and I'm afforded that beautiful grace and opportunity to speak truthfully, I will speak truthfully. But often, in order to have that conversation, I wouldn't necessarily go straight to intrinsically disordered. I mean, I think we're sort of starting to get into a more technical realm anyway.
Yeah.
And I think the initial conversations don't exist in that, or for a lot of people don't exist in that space. But what happens when you've done that well, according to, Cam has done the best Cam version of a conversation that he can about this. And then someone says, well, are you saying then, they start putting two and two together. Are you saying then that the church thinks that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered, or they are disordered in some way? Maybe they don't even say intrinsically. What happens in that moment is the question, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, because what do we even mean when we say intrinsically disordered? And maybe that's what we need to try and get back to.
Yeah.
For example, I don't know if adulterous relationships are intrinsically disordered. That's where I think the word intrinsic is important, because intrinsic says it's kind of like in the act, in the kind of act itself, right?
Well, it's always there's no context in which you could say this becomes
whereas
ordered action.
Adultery is kind of the right thing in the wrong context, right? Whereas what the church is saying about homosexual relations is that it's not the right thing in the wrong context. It's the wrong kind of thing because of the structure of the act, right?
Yeah.
So like both words are doing quite a lot of work. And then disordered, disordered. Lots of things we do are disordered. Everything we do that's not helping us one step further towards flourishing as a human being is in some way disordered. So we can definitely put our hands up and saying, like, I'm doing disordered stuff all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah, but intrinsically kind of says, well, there's kind of no way of doing this where it will bring you to your flourishing.
And that's true. That's the problem.
Yeah.
You live in a culture that has just embraced the big lie, and to even tell the truth becomes like, oh gosh, that's really freaky, and it's hard. But I don't know. I mean, how do you have an honest pastoral conversation that does not communicate the fullness of truth with people when it's appropriate, of course?
Well, and
I'm not talking about walking up to strangers on the street saying, "Do you know?" No.
Well, here's another thing. Sherry Waddell, one author I really like, she says, never accept a label in place of a story. So,
Cool.
So someone says to me, by the way, I'm gay. Just the way I've been formed and the way I've been brought up, I feel like I have to make a judgment at that point. I've got to either say, oh, that's great, or, oh, like, but actually, no, I don't have to make a judgment on the label they've given themselves. My next question should probably be, well, tell me, like, how did you get to that? Like, tell me your story. I want to hear about your life, and how you get to this point where you say this about yourself, where you understand yourself this way, right? And so we don't have to start with a judgment. We can start with inviting someone to enter into a deeper connection with us, right? And being open to them and listening, and not feeling like we have to give our own label to things. Like, you've given yourself this label, but I'm going to label it in this way. And
yeah,
you know what I mean? No, it doesn't.
Yeah. And I that makes sense to me. That to me is what I would consider to be humane, and I think authentically humane conversation. And that's what it should look like. You're not trying to, you're not reducing the person to an object for your own end game, is the point.
Yeah.
And you're not trying to impose yourself upon that person. It's always about proposing, I believe, the truth, allowing that opportunity. And I absolutely agree in that regard. But I think when the point comes where the honesty and the clarity has to be had, and I think particularly in an educational context, it seems if we're going to teach these issues in an RE context, then I don't know how you can avoid teaching the fullness of the truth about this and just clearly explaining it. And then if you're going to get punched in the head, metaphorically speaking, you have to be prepared to take the punch. Because I think one thing we must remember is, again, this whole idea that the modern world is just the objective one, when it's absolutely not. And one of the things we are swimming in, all of us, is a post-Freudian era, Sigmund Freud. And before Freud, there's a couple of things that changed that are big. One is the idea of personal happiness being the path to flourishing becomes more preeminent. And so self-gratification is put ahead of the sort of the pile rather than self-giving. But also the sexual act goes from being just a sexual act to being an identity. And that's a big shift. And that's a move away from our anthropology, which is, no, we are all children of God, regardless of whatever else is going on. We are sacred image bearers. And we live in an identity-based culture now, which says, well, I am X person, not just a person, I am X person. So the X comes in front of the person. And so I think that there's this whole bigger grappling we've got to have with the culture and to be able to speak into that deeper level as well. And I think that's all a factor in this as well. And I think what that means, basically, in a nutshell, is I think there are moments where you're going to have to tell that truth about what our tradition actually believes and why. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. It's just that I think it's to do with the communicating the truth in love. I think you made a comment earlier on about, you can't communicate love without the truth. You can sort of communicate the truth without love.
Yeah.
Is that what you said? But
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I sort of say yes and no to that second part because you can in a certain way, but maybe you can't because it's not going to be understood right without love. I think the truth is misunderstood without love. And so because people draw their own conclusions from the things that you say, and they might be false ones. And so then you haven't really communicated the truth effectively. And so I think the love comes into it, and it's really important. And this is just it's an area where people are so vulnerable. So,
well, and that's my point that earlier was, you can have the truth without love. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think the truth should always be presented with a sense of charity and also humility, because there, but for the grace of God, go you or I. I've got stuff in my past that I'm definitely not proud of. And I am so relieved that the grace of God and the mercy of God is great. It's brought me out of that. But I want to see others come to that fullness as well. And so the flip side of that is this idea, the false idea as well, you're being compassionate by keeping the truth from people. Sure. And an analogy I like to use is, if you saw someone that you walk past a group of people who were swimming in an effluent pond, a sewage pond, and they were saying how awesome it was and how great it was, to sort of, if you knew how dangerous that was, and then to sort of walk away from that person, just go, oh, good on you, well done, Cam, great swim, enjoy it. I don't do that, but good on you. I think there's something we haven't loved that person. I
should tell them that it's intrinsically disgusting.
yeah, get out of that pond now. But and I'm not. Please hear me. I'm not trying to use that as a direct metaphor for homosexuality. I'm just saying that if a person is doing something that is harmful, that is spiritually, psychologically, that their fullness of flourishing is harmed and they're spiritually at risk, then I don't see how it's loving to walk away if the opportunity is afforded to you to actually propose the truth and not have proposed the truth to the person.
No, and I'm not talking about not proposing the truth. I'm saying there's a need for really good language that's true and that communicates love, at both, because that will be effective. The truth without love won't be effective. And love without the truth is all over the show. So, and just because our tradition has a certain language doesn't mean the language can't be adapted. Our tradition is full of adapting language.
Sure.
If you read the saints of the 1700s, they don't sound the same as the saints of the 20th century.
But the concept, the truth is not being changed though, right? It's the presentation.
It is. But the packaging matters because that's often how we really, we couch it in love, right? And that those goalposts shift because the sensibilities of cultures shift.
The question then is, if someone, let's go back to that fictional scenario I put to you, someone says, well, Cam, are you saying that this is disordered? Maybe they don't say disordered. So in your mind, do you think you could say in place of that, it's always wrong? Do you know what I mean? Is that still too harsh? Because that's the question you start to grapple with. And what happens when people think that's too harsh? You know, I'm not sure how you get out of that.
I think often because people don't generally respond that well, especially, well, it depends. It depends on the receptivity of the person, right? But most people are only going to be partly receptive. People generally respond better to being asked questions.
Yep, sure.
Right, rather than just being told statements. And so there'll be a time for statements, but I just think we need to do some work. We can't just rest on catechism language necessarily. And I'm not throwing it out the window. I'm just saying its usefulness might be very, very limited when it comes to communicating this truth.
Well, here's a question then. Do you make a distinction between internal comms, shall we say, and external? So when you are speaking, say, in a media to a secular media entity versus if you were actually teaching your own people, surely the catechism has to be the norm there.
Yeah, but this is what I was saying before. I want to kind of have a consistent way of speaking in those contexts, right? Because in any case, I want to be modeling in, if I'm a teacher, which I'm not, but if I want to be modeling in the classroom and modeling in front of the camera in a media situation, this is how you speak about these things. Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question. And I don't have like final answers, but this is kind of where I'm at the moment on it.
Yeah, I get it. And I definitely hear that. And we're in a cultural context, as I said, where there are these very powerful forces, and it's also a very censorious culture where you say even remotely the wrong thing, and gosh, it can be really badly. It can end up really badly. And I think all of those things are a factor in this. But I come back to that point whereby, and this is something I've really discovered in my own personal reading, and something I try to do is continually read and read and read. Finish one book, pick up another. And one of the things I'm discovering is just how much we have sold ourselves short, if you like, because we've just sort of tried to make it the lowest common denominator all the time. And what that does is we've stripped ourselves of our patrimony, and now we're in a situation where I to be honest with you, how many Catholics do you know who could actually have a sort of semblance of a conversation where they speak correctly what the actual tradition believes about these issues? And it's a small number of people. And I think a big reason for that is because of the radio silence, and because perhaps we haven't I think it's also complex too. I totally hear what you're saying. You know, as a person who's in comms, you don't simply communicate to yourself or to your particular fan base. You are talking to people, and you're speaking into a culture that often has taken language itself in the modern context and completely changed it. And so there's all those factors at play. I totally get that. But and when I read Bishop Vincent's statement, there's things in here that make me say this is more political than theological. And that's the problem I have. Like when he says in here, at the same time colluding with the forces of oppression and the ill treatment of racial minorities, women and homosexual persons, that speaks clearly to me of the modern identitarian and even Marxist view of power struggles and power dynamics. And I'd say that's straight outside. So I see in this, there's some problems here. Do you know what I mean? It plays into that thing that is outside of our tradition.
I think it's fine for me to say, like, I've colluded in these things, but to say the church has done this, it seems to be shifting the blame away from my personal responsibility.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm happy to say, like, there are people in my life, say, struggling with issues of sexuality who I haven't treated very well. And I'm ashamed for the way I've treated them. It's not like I bullied them or anything, but it was like I didn't actually know how to respond properly to them. And I feel that, right? So I'm happy to say, like, look, I've failed in this area, but I think I'm not going to say the church, the bad old church has failed. It's like, no, it's me who's failed. And hopefully with the help of the church, I can be better.
To be fair, though, I think we also need to be cautious. I think this is one of the problems of our age, is the tendency to, I think, overplay words as well. and conversations, and to turn them into these big, momentous, divine things when, we're incarnational. That's our faith. It's incarnational. What that means is there's a certain messiness that we accept in those relations. And I think one of the tendencies of their age is to say, oh, you said the wrong word. You must hate, or you must be a this or a that. It's and there's like no forgiveness. There's no, and I think we've got to be careful about on our side. It's not an excuse at all for sinful behaviors, but we've got to be careful that we don't become scrupulous as well. You know what I mean? In that regard.
For sure.
We've got to restore, I think we've got to restore the dialogos, the dialogue, and go to where people are and have those conversations,
Yeah. Great. Let's I think it's a good place to round off. There were a few other smaller points, but let's round off there for now, Brennan. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it's made me want to have more of these. But I'll give you the last word. What do you think is the way forward now for us as we wrestle with this issue and these things?
I think we need to recover our voice. I really do. And I think our voice needs to be heard in the public square. We've got every right to be there, and it needs to be heard. And we've just got to stop being afraid. Don't let other people put their prejudicial baggage on us. Don't ever be uncharitable. Don't ever stop listening, but don't allow our voice to be silenced by those who just don't want us present in the public square. And I think in regards to this document in particular, I really strongly feel that this document needs to go back for a rewrite. I really do. I in its current form, there are issues I think that need to be amended at the very least. And I think one thing I'd say is if it was actually more aligned with Pope Francis and what he's had to say, it would look very different. And I think that's something to consider in all of this. And like you've mentioned, the Australian bishops, their document, I'd encourage people to read that in contrast. I think also the document that Rome put out, it's about 2 years ago, on this particular issue. Again, read that. I think there's really good communications of these truths that I think our document could really benefit from. And so you take what's good, you keep what's good, and you edit into that document what is missing and perhaps tweak what is not clear enough.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. Great talking to you. Thanks a lot.
Bless you, brother.